I wanted to say that it's good to see all of you, or at least see your square with your name in it. I am Warren Tenney, and along with Tim Tamer, we are the co-chairs for the post-2025 AMAs committee. And thank you for being willing to participate in our first remote meeting for this committee. We do appreciate if you have your video on. We don't mind seeing what you are wearing or if you've had a haircut or not. It's just good to see your faces during this time when we haven't been able to have meetings in person, and it helps make it feel a little bit more like we're in person. So, and through seeing all of you on your screens, it gives an odd feeling that we are participating in some type of reality TV show, maybe called As the Water Turns. So I also want to just say thank you to ADWR. Meeting remotely has its challenges, and we certainly appreciate DWR staff's efforts to coordinate, arrange, and keep this meeting running smoothly. And when you are not as, and we appreciate your patience as we deal with any glitches that may arise during the next 2 hours. As Zach mentioned, he's going to help us stay muted, but unless you're wanting to speak, or unless you are actually speaking. So it is very helpful if you also make an effort to stay muted, and especially if you're calling in on the phone. For some reason, the phone calls seem to cause a little more challenges. As Zach explained, we're going to try to use the raise the hand feature. And as we progress through the meeting, we will have times for discussion. And we would prefer, and we're hoping to hear your voices. We'd rather have dialogue during this meeting rather than just using the chat feature to express your comments or questions. So let's go ahead and get started, and let's go ahead with the slides. Just wanted to give a reminder as well as to anyone that's joining us for the first time. The overall objective for the post-2025 AMAs committee is to build on the foundation we have with the Groundwater Management Code and the Assured Water Supply Program, and look at what areas can be strengthened and improved to better manage water in the AMAs. So we are focusing on AMAs. We have made large strides in our water management since 1980. So much that I personally believe Arizona does the best job of managing its water here in the West. But we still have room for improvement. We're not perfect yet. And so we can learn from our experiences over the last 40 years and determine how we can improve and increase the effectiveness of our water management. So I want to just go over real quickly this slide. You've seen it before. So to accomplish our objective, our approach is to first agree on what challenges are facing the AMAs and then develop solutions. So the committee is compiling a list of those issues in the AMAs that we want to work on, analyze them, and prioritize. And we will then present those issues to the Governor's Water Council. Once we have the council's agreement that these are the challenges that need to be tackled, the committee will then develop solutions and strategies to address those issues. Again, it will be easier to develop solutions if we first have consensus on the challenges. And I just want to emphasize that this committee is open to everyone. We have said from the beginning, though, that we want individuals who are willing to roll up their sleeves and to work through these issues to improve water management in the AMAs. So we appreciate those of you who have sat around the table and contributed to our discussions so far, and appreciate those of you who are going to be contributing and helping out with today's discussion. So next slide. Here is a list of the challenges we have identified to date. This list is not considered complete. We anticipate more issues will be added. These issues are laid out in more detail in the committee materials that can be found on ADWR's website, which Zach showed you. And we will hopefully revisit this list at the end of the meeting. Next slide. So at our February meeting, we looked at 3 issues and talked about how to better understand why and how they are challenges. And those 3 issues that we focused on are unreplenished groundwater pumping, exempt wells, and hydrologic disconnect between recharge and recovery, and also pumping and replenishment. To document these issues, we wanted to draft a paper to explain the issue in a succinct, straightforward way so that the Governor's Water Council and anyone else interested would be able to understand the issue and why we should work to find a solution or strategy to address it. We are intentionally calling these papers issue briefs. We want it to be brief. We're not trying to do a dissertation on the issue. We want it to be an objective overview that finds the balance between enough information to give content without having to explain every detail in the entire Groundwater Management Act. We are assuming the reader has some knowledge of Arizona water, and we want it to be technical but readable. Next slide. So when we discussed these 3 issues in February, we decided that we should draft issue briefs about them and then receive input from the committee. In March, with the COVID-19 situation, we knew that we would not be able to meet in April as we had planned. Tim and I, along with ADWR, did not want to lose any progress that we had made. So we proceeded with drafting 3 issue briefs. It's always a challenge for a committee to draft a paper, but we figured we had to start by putting words on paper and then sharing them with the committee members. And that's what we wanted to do, that even if we weren't able to meet in person, we wanted to involve you. And so we distributed the first draft briefs to the committee members who have actively been participating in the committee discussions to review and comment on the draft. We appreciated very much the comments that we received. They have been very helpful in being able to make the second draft be a lot more solid in explaining the issue. We believe the second version or draft meets our overall goal to give a solid overview about each of these 3 issues. This second draft of the 3 issue briefs was sent to the committee members last Thursday. The draft issue briefs can be found on ADWR's website, as Zach had explained. Again, these briefs are meant to describe the issue and do not include solutions to address the issue. So today, we would like to review the issue briefs, discuss them, hear if any substantive points are missing so they can be finalized, and that we can then turn our attention to other issues. So before we go ahead and look at the first issue brief, I thought this might be a good point just to pause, see if there was any questions or any comments up to this point. So I'm not, Zach is shaking his head for me, so we will continue, and let's go ahead and take a look at the issue brief regarding hydrologic disconnect. the issue of hydrologic disconnect was identified and discussed by the committee at our last, actually we discussed this in our last 3 meetings. The issue brief provides an overview of the challenges associated with hydrologic disconnect. The issue statement concisely describes the issue as the storage and recovery of water supplies in hydrologically disconnected areas within AMAs has the potential to create or worsen localized groundwater depletion. Similar issues may arise in the context of hydrologically disconnected pumping and replenishment to meet requirements of the Assured Water Supply Program. Next slide. So the brief gives an overview of the regulatory framework for recharge and recovery and for pumping and replenishment. Both of these activities have promoted the use of renewable water supplies and being able to meet requirements of the Assured Water Supply Program. Legally, recharge and recovery, as well as pumping and replenishment, need only to take place within the same AMA, even though AMAs cover a large geographic area. For example, the Phoenix AMA is 100 miles wide, and we know groundwater conditions in one part of the AMA can be quite different from other parts of the AMA. Per current statutes, recharge and recovery does not have to occur within the respective service area of a water provider, but can occur in areas that can be hydrologically distinct from another area. This also means stored water as long-term storage credits can also be recovered years or decades later, whether that water remains or may have physically migrated. Next slide. So when water is stored in one location and recovered elsewhere, there is the potential for local groundwater conditions to experience negative consequences. Local groundwater depletion can be caused by different factors, but hydrologic disconnect can contribute or exacerbate the situation. This makes sense. If we are recovering in an area that never had any storage, we'll be drawing down those water levels in that area. This can create imbalances within the AMA, in which the AMA can see groundwater declining in some areas, and then other areas could see groundwater levels rising, which could be problematic in some instances. When we only store water in a particular area and not pump in that area, sometimes water levels rise too high and result in operational constraints, such as limiting the amount of storage that can be done in the area. The issue brief also notes that hydrologic disconnect could be positive, such as recharging in a cone of depression and recovering from a waterlogged area. Next slide. So we know there can be benefits when there is a hydrologic connection. In Tucson, its central well field has seen significant rises in its water levels when, rather than continue to have those wells pumped, Tucson began pumping from the area of where its CAP water was being stored. Subsidence rates also measurably decreased. Next slide. We do know that the hydrologic disconnect is happening now and that it can have an impact on local groundwater issues. This is why some regulatory framework and policies exist, from ADWR well spacing and recovery siting requirements to CAGRD being required to replenish in the East or West Phoenix AMA, depending where the pumping occurred. While there may be a lack of analysis or documentation on those policies, as well as the impacts surrounding hydrologic disconnect can vary, there is little question that a large and persistent disconnect between recharge and recovery could lead to localized aquifer hotspots, which would benefit from improved water management. Any suggested solutions will need to be flexible to address the local situation. Next slide. So that gives an overview of the points, or the main points that were made in the issue brief, and I would acknowledge that it's not necessarily ideal to participate in this discussion remotely. Preference would be that we would be all sitting in the same room together. But we are going on the assumption that those who wanted to edit or add points to the briefs all have responded, and we do appreciate the feedback we initially received, but we want to encourage that if you have points or comments, please speak up today. And these were two of the main questions we wanted to ask of the committee. Are these substantive points? Are there any substantive points that have not been included? And does the brief provide enough of a foundation of understanding on this issue so we can begin the next step to explore what actions we may want to propose? So, Zach, if we could, why don't we not share the slide right now so that it can be easier to see folks that want to maybe comment. And just wanted to see what your comments are on this. I believe Dennis Rule would like to make some comments on this, or someone from the Southern Arizona Home Builders or from the Central Arizona Home
Builders. Hi, Warren. This is Dennis. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Still can't figure out how to get my camera to show me on this thing, but anyway, thank you. So we, David Godleski and Spencer Camps and Rob Anderson and I had actually had a virtual meeting with Warren and Tim and a number of DWR staff last Friday afternoon. So we wanted to thank everybody for basically meeting our tough schedule on late Friday afternoon before a 3-day weekend, holiday weekend. We appreciate it. It was a good phone call. And do have a kind of a statement from Spencer and David Godleski on behalf of home builders of Central Arizona and Southern Arizona Home Builders Association. So I'll kind of read off of, sorry for being formal, but I'll kind of read off of that draft statement. Again, thank you for the virtual meeting last Friday. And as we indicated at that time, we think that the second draft of the issue paper was a significant improvement over the first draft. But we also expressed that we still have some ongoing concerns that even the second draft fails to provide important context on the relative scales of the issues that are associated with storage and recovery in comparison to pumping and replenishment. As we indicated in our initial comments, there were over 11 million acre feet of water stored underground over the 5 AMAs by 2016. Whereas the scale of pumping and replenishment is much smaller than that. Actually total replenishment between 95 through 2013, 18 years, was only 336,000 acre feet, as compared to 11 million acre feet of water that's been stored across the AMAs. And we believe that even this generalized, as Warren summarized the issue brief, really should make clear the difference in scale between the potential water level impacts that are associated with recovering long-term storage credits outside the area of impacts associated with pumping and replenishment. In an apparent response to one of our comments, initial comments on the first draft, it said that data and analysis should be included documenting actual examples, if any, of the concerns expressed. The second draft contains the statement that there is a lack of comprehensive analysis or documentation as to the exact extent to which hydrologic disconnect will impact groundwater conditions. And while this may generally be true, there is one specific modeling analysis that does impact the potential scale of issues associated with storage and recovery, and that's actually the 2010 Assured Water Supply analysis that was conducted by DWR and that is cited, referenced in the issue brief. So this analysis basically came while the Phoenix AMA cities were looking to renew their assured water supply designation. And apparently, in an apparent attempt to maximize their claims to physically available groundwater, there were projections that rather than using their existing surface water treatment and delivery systems, that they would do recharge and recovery in a very large scale. And what resulted crashed. Groundwater projections crashed throughout the Phoenix AMA area. But then DWR did another scenario in which they assumed that the cities used 80% of their existing surface water treatment and delivery capacity, and that resulted in significant improvements in groundwater level declines, very minimal throughout much of the AMA. And we feel that this detailed modeling by DWR clearly illustrates the potential negative impacts of large-scale recovery of stored water outside the area of storage. Further, when you look at the unreplenished groundwater withdrawals issue brief, the unreplenished groundwater demand in the Phoenix AMA alone has averaged over 376,000 acre-feet per year. And that's more than the total amount of CEG or CEG. So we believe that these facts do demonstrate that the scale of pumping and replenishment activities is really insignificant when compared to the potential negative impacts of unreplenished groundwater usage and recovery of water outside the area of storage. And we feel that the issue brief should indicate the difference in scale between these activities. So again, apologize for reading, but wanted to try to stick to the script. So thank you for the opportunity to comment. I hope it came away clearly. I can see people moving their heads around, but that's about all I can see. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Appreciate that. And so what I'm hearing is that the suggestion is that there needs to be included in the brief a way of distinction, drawing a distinction with the between recharge and recovery's impact versus pumping and replenishment's impact. So is that a fair summary?
Am I still on? Is the microphone still on?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Our general feeling is that the issue paper, issue brief as it is, kind of would give a reader the impression that the potential issues from pumping and replenishment are essentially equivalent to the potential issues from storage and recovery outside the area of impact. And we think that there are substantial differences in those, particularly because of the amount of long-term storage credits, a vast number of which are stored in areas that don't currently have recovery capability. We think that there should be at least some acknowledgement that the potential scale of the impact between those two activities, between storage and recovery and pumping and replenishment, is pretty significant.
Okay. Thank you. Other thoughts from the committee on that issue or anything else in regards with the brief?
Looks like we got a hand raised from Kathy Ferris. Kathy, I'm gonna unmute you and let you say whatever you need to say.
Well, hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Warren, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So it's really hard to comment intelligently on what Dennis just read because we don't have it really in front of us. But I would say that as someone who's spent a fair amount of time working on K-grid groundwater withdrawal and replenishment issues, I don't think that you can just walk away and say there's just a really huge problem with underground storage and recovery, and the problem with K-grid groundwater pumping and replenishment is just tiny. I think that the Kyle Center paper demonstrates some of the real potential issues that are out there for massive groundwater pumping that might be reliant on K-grid and that would not be replenished where that groundwater pumping takes place. Now, if you want to separate those two issues more distinctly and address them more distinctly, I think that's a fair comment. But I can't see that you can say, well, one's a really big problem and the other's not.
And thank you, Kathy. And just one thing, just to make sure it's clear, that this paper or this brief is trying to address the issue of hydrologic disconnect. So, even when it states that the 11 million acre feet of water that's been stored through 2016, it's not saying that all of that is disconnected, but as Dennis pointed out with the 2010 study, there's clear indication that there could be a lot of challenges in the future when it comes to recovery of those credits. Other comments, suggestions?
Hey Warren, this is Haley Paul. Can you hear me?
Hey Haley, yes.
Hey, I'll try to share my screen. I was wondering if a problem to add to the hydrologic disconnect issue is the fact that it seems like it's hard to get new recharge permits for cities. And if that plays into this at all, so even if you wanted to, recharge closer to your service area, is that a hard thing? Are there difficulties with that? And is that something that this issue brief could address or this committee could take on? I just wanted to throw that out there.
Oh, thank you. That's a good point. Other comments?
Yes, we have a hand raised from Mr. Rob Anderson. I'm going to unmute you, sir. Go ahead.
So I've been knighted. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, we can hear you.
I just wanted to respond just briefly to Kathy's point, and I wanted to clarify. We're not saying that that this paper should say the GRD replenishment location of replenishment is not an issue. There's a reference in the paper to the volume of credits that are stored throughout the AMAs. And what we had suggested was some language that showed what the current and some of the projected future replenishment would occur and how those volumes related to each other. All it is not it's not a it's not intended to be a final say on what are the relationships of these two. It's simply trying to put the replenishment volumes in context. That's all. That's the simple point. That's it.
Okay, so we'll have you put on mute again here, Rob. And then we're going to move to Laura. Unmute you, Laura. Go ahead.
All right, thank you, Zach. Laura Grignano, CAGRD manager. Just thinking about the comments that we've just heard, I might suggest possibly that we just quantify, try to quantify like we've done in the unreplenished groundwater paper. We do have a list of the pumping that's unquantified. Perhaps we do something similar with this paper and add quantities of recharged stored water to be recovered in the future, as well as water that's been replenished for our members pumping. I might add to Kathy Ferris's comment, I believe she said might be reliant. So it looks to be that Kathy maybe is referring to potential future CAGRD membership. I don't know if we do start looking at that issue, then I do think it's only fair to think about future storage too, and additional storage that could then be recovered. But I think quantifying those two, pumping and recovery as well as replenishment, would be helpful.
Thank you, Laura. I think that comment, along with Rob and just all the comments, I think we certainly could find a way to include in the brief that context that is being suggested in regards to replenishment, without putting any necessarily judgment on it of whether it's good or bad.
You have a comment from Dave Roberts. I can read this real quick. So it says, I think it's important that all of the issues being addressed by this committee should be into context, as Dennis is suggesting, for groundwater pumping and replenishment. We have a lot more data today than back in 1980, and therefore we should put these issues into context so that we have an understanding of just how significant or insignificant an issue really is in the overall management of groundwater in the AMAs going forward. It should be a standard operating practice by ADWR. If not, we may actually be putting a lot of effort into issues that may not be as significant as they may seem to be. This should also be a forward-looking context as well to capture the concern that Kathy Ferris has raised. And then another comment from Terry Sue. Can we stop referring to water stored at GSFs as in lieu water? There is not a water source called in lieu, and it makes storage at GSFs seem like it's not real water. And then also, when you're done speaking, if you could take your hand down, your raised hand piece there, click on the icon again and take the hand off so I know that you've already spoken and don't need to be called on again. Thanks.
Great. Any other thoughts in regards with this issue brief dealing with hydrologic disconnect? And as I said earlier, I will go back and I think we can come up with something to address provide a little more context in regards with what's going on with pumping and replenishment, to balance it with the recharge and recovery.
The comment came in from Ham Hughes. It says, it seems like we may be comparing apples and oranges a bit. The paper refers to all the long-term storage credits there are, but then talks about annual replenishment obligation. 2016 ADWR data shows there was around 200,000 acre-feet of recovery in the AMAs. Either show totals to date or show both as annual numbers. Yeah.
Thank you, Pam. So, recognizing there's a few other tweaks there, is there an overall sense, though, that the brief does provide enough of a foundation to understand or to explain this issue so that would allow us to then move forward with looking at solutions? In other words, does the brief provide a pretty good foundation of explaining to the Governor's Water Council of why we would want to look at this and spend more time coming up with a strategy and solution? So well, there, I see a thumbs up. Okay. I'm seeing more thumbs up. That's helpful. And why don't we go ahead and move on to the next issue brief and go through that real quick. So if you can share your screen again, Zach.
Cindy, I'm passing the ball back to you.
Thank you, Cindy, for getting it back up there. So we'll go to the next slide. Great, thank you. So at our February meeting, we looked at data from ADWR on exempt wells in each AMA, and the committee decided that our focus should be on the Prescott AMA based on that data that we looked at. So the issue statement reads as follows. Exempt wells may disproportionately contribute to groundwater overdraft in the Prescott Active Management Area, placing aquifers in that AMA at greater risk for long-term viability. Next slide. So we all understand that exempt wells pump 35 gallons per minute or less and are exempt from regulations. When the Groundwater Management Act was passed, it was believed these small wells would have a negligible impact on the aquifer and that regulating them would be administratively burdensome. Before drilling an exempt well, the well owner is not required to demonstrate physical or legal availability of the groundwater supply. The exception to this is dry lot subdivisions within an AMA that will include exempt wells on each lot and must first obtain a certificate of assured water supply. Exempt wells are not subject to ADWR's well spacing rules. However, they may have an impact on the siting of non-exempt wells because ADWR will not permit a new well, including a non-exempt well operated by a municipal provider, if withdrawals from the proposed well will exceed 10 feet of additional drawdown of water levels at neighboring wells after the first 5 years of operation. Next slide. So the issue brief then provides more context on exempt wells within the Prescott AMA. Prescott AMA contains 30% of the exempt wells in all 5 AMAs, but represents only 3% of the AMA land area. And there are now over 12,900 exempt wells in the Prescott AMA, serving over 25,000 people. ADWR creates estimates of exempt well withdrawals each year based on the number of people in an AMA that are not served by municipal water providers. The estimated annual withdrawals of exempt domestic wells in the Prescott AMA total just over 2,500 acre-feet. The potential pumping capacity of Prescott AMA exempt wells total over 150,000 acre-feet per year. The issue brief described potential pumping capacity because it illustrates that exempt wells may represent a larger source of future groundwater withdrawals than anticipated. In contrast, the proportion of water used by exempt wells in other AMAs is much smaller. For instance, Phoenix AMA groundwater pumping by exempt wells is estimated at less than 1% of municipal water use in the AMA. Next slide. So finally, the issue brief summarizes and describes various issues that can arise from the proliferation of exempt wells. First, exempt wells do not provide any assurance of a long-term water supply to those who are reliant upon them. This touches on consumer protection related issues. Proliferation of exempt wells in Prescott AMA specifically could impact the ability to meet AMA management goal. While the well spacing rules do not apply to exempt wells, their concentrated existence in some areas may have a significant impact on local water providers who may need to extend their infrastructure further to avoid such conflicts. In other words, exempt wells are given protections from the spacing requirements placed on other wells, yet they remain unregulated. Next slide. So, again, wanted to ask all of you, are there any substantive points that have not been included? Does this brief provide enough of a foundation of understanding on the issue so we can begin the next step to explore what actions we may want to propose? And please let us know please raise your hand and Zach will call on you. Is there any comments from the Prescott AMA?
Not seeing any comments at this time, Warren.
Okay. Would it be fair, is it fair among the committee to assume that the exempt well issue brief does a good job of, I see one comment that Carlos Ronstadt just wrote that.
Yeah, I can read it. So it says, in the Prescott AMA, you cannot separate exempt wells from the assured water supply issues. People drill exempt wells because they have no choice. Gary Beverly says, this analysis is very one-sided. We'll send written comments later. Not acceptable. Looking forward to that, Gary. Thank you.
And John Munderloh, it looks like, has a comment.
He says, as exempt wells run dry, the homeowners seek and obtain water from the nearby water providers.
So I think the paper does note both John Munderloh's comment as well as notes the challenge in the Prescott AMA that Carlos noted.
Gary notes that exempt wells run dry because of overpumping by large providers.
So, I'll just say that the intent of these briefs have been trying to be as objective and to show what the issue is. Clearly, there are challenges in regards to this in the Prescott AMA, and it's an opportunity to look at what has been going on, including whether large providers are over pumping.
And John Munderloh notes that exempt wells are afforded protections from non-exempt wells.
Right, which the issue brief points out. You know, as we've been dealing with these issues, I think all of us, everyone on the committee recognizes that none of these issues are easy. And just trying to succinctly describe them in a few pages is a challenge unto itself. And so we're hoping that by putting these briefs together, it provides then a starting point for us to be able to look at and address the challenges and find a way to improve water management in the AMAs. Any other comments regarding the exempt well one?
Looks like, okay. Carlos has his hand raised. He's not sure. Oh wait, I think I hear him.
I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I got you.
Yeah, I'm kind of on both sides of the fence. I'm not a big fan of exempt wells for all kinds of reasons, but the flip side is in the Prescott AMA, it's so difficult to get a certificate of assured water supply now that the only way people can ever realize any value from their real property is to, do lot splits. I'm dealing with one of those right now, even as we speak, where my client's trying to get a certificate and is pretty close to it. But, we have lots of people who are upset about a subdivision because they want to do lot splits. And I think one of the issues here is there any way that you can make it somewhat easier for people to put in a centralized water system rather than do lot splits? I'm not a fan of lot splits, but that's what you're left with up there now. There's a lot of property that can be split.
And Carlos, thank you for that. I think those are points that we have to wrestle with if we're going to try to address this issue and being able to develop a solution. If we're concerned about the proliferation of exempt wells, it's going to mean that we're going to have to look at what's all involved with the points that you just made and other points. Any other comments?
Warren, there are no more comments at this time.
Okay. Well, why don't we venture forth and try to tackle the third issue brief. So we have discussed groundwater, we have discussed unreplenished groundwater pumping or withdrawal at each of our previous 3 meetings and agreed that we needed to draft an issue brief on this challenge. The issue is stated as following. In Arizona's active management areas, unreplenished groundwater withdrawals by all water-using sectors, combined with a lack of sufficient incentives to either reduce withdrawals or mitigate the impacts may limit the state's ability to meet the AMA long-term groundwater management goals. Next slide. So the issue brief defines unreplenished groundwater withdrawal as referring to groundwater that is legally withdrawn without requirement or obligation to artificially replenish or replace that volume of water back. So the issue brief is an opportunity to summarize this groundwater pumping that is allowed and show how much of this type of withdrawal is occurring. Next slide. So what we wanted to do was to try to, felt it was important based on our previous discussions to make sure that we are showing what occurs in each of the sectors. And so the issue brief details the allowable groundwater withdrawal by sector, and thus demonstrates that groundwater withdrawal is not unique or significant for just one sector. In agriculture, there is irrigation grandfathered groundwater rights, including GSF water utilization. In the industrial sector, there are general industrial use permits, along with type 1 and type 2 non-irrigation grandfather rights. Next slide. In the municipal sector, unreplenished groundwater withdrawals include pre-1995 subdivisions, groundwater allowance, extinguishment credits that come from irrigation grandfathered rights in type 1 or type 2 non-irrigation grandfathered rights, exempt wells, and remediated groundwater. As we have discussed previously in other meetings, it's important to recognize and acknowledge that unreplenished groundwater withdrawal does occur among all three sectors, and so we will have to work together if we want to minimize or reduce such pumping in the future. Next slide. So the issue brief ends with a table that breaks out the average annual groundwater demand between 2012 through 2016, pursuant to the unreplenished groundwater uses described in the issue brief by sector and by AMA. Here we split that table among two slides. These values include groundwater demands such as pumping and GSF demand, but do not include the recovery of water stored underground and not legally classified as groundwater, such as effluent that has been stored for long-term storage credits. All values are shown to illustrate the extent to which allowable groundwater rights are exercised in each AMA. Next slide. And here is the part of the table that shows the offsets to those demands that can be attributed to a given sector. Groundwater withdrawals in combination with the use of other water supplies may contribute to incidental recharge, and that is shown here by sector and AMA. CAGRD replenishment is also accounted for under the municipal sector. Overall, certain incidental and artificial recharge offsets are provided by sector in order to demonstrate the final average unreplenished groundwater demand by sector and AMA between 2012 and through 2016. Next slide. And so, again, that we wanted to visit with you or discuss with you, are there any substantive points that have not been included? And does this brief provide enough of a foundation of understanding the issue so we can begin the next step to explore what actions we may want to propose? So please raise your hand and Zach will call on you.
So we got a comment from Krista McJunkin. She says, is pumping from the Buckeye waterlogged area treated as unreplenished groundwater? What about drainage well pumping?
So Zach, could we see if there's someone at ADWR that may have an answer on that? I don't know if Natalie or someone else might.
Hi, Warren. This is Natalie.
Hi, Natalie.
I guess for everyone else, this is Natalie Mast from ADWR. So I'm not positive about the drainage pumping, where exactly that's included, but pumping from the Buckeye waterlogged area still would be treated as a groundwater demand, yes. That demand would be offset as kind of the others are. It would be offset by incidental recharge, but it would be treated as a groundwater demand like the other ones.
So it is included. Thank you. Other comments?
I'm not seeing any at this time, Warren. So Krista just followed up with that, Natalie. She says, should it be included? Isn't it better not replenish that pumping?
So, Krista, that would be one of the questions we would need to ask of as we go forward in looking at this issue and trying to come up with a strategy. And that would be in areas where there's waterlog, what is the best way of approaching that? But what we thought was important to capture in the issue brief was to show what type of groundwater, unreplenished groundwater withdrawals are occurring, so that we at least get a sense of everything that's happening. And then we would have a better opportunity, or it'd be easier then to go in and start working on each one. So that was part of the reason for including everything right now in the issue brief.
And Krista says, addressing it in the solution phase makes sense. Thanks. I had a question from Brian Betcher. It says, is there a benefit to showing groundwater level changes compared to unreplenished groundwater?
Brian, that's a good point. We decided to approach the brief by showing the amount of pumping, just so that we again had a good sense of how much water are we talking about. We often hear about that there's unreplenished groundwater or withdrawals, or there's this allowable groundwater pumping that's occurring, but felt it was important to put in one document, capture what that looks like. As far as with the groundwater level changes, I think that's part of, we thought, I think part of it was, first, we thought it would be easier to get the numbers for all the groundwater with, or the unreplenished groundwater pumping that's occurring. And then we thought that looking at groundwater levels would be something that we would want to look at as you move forward on the solution phase.
A comment from John Munderloh, who says, tables should include municipal incidental recharge in the Prescott AMA.
Warren, this is Natalie. Yep, I was just going to chime in. Hello. So previously, for the purposes of safe yield, we had not included municipal incidental recharge in the Prescott and Santa Cruz active management areas. Genuinely, the only reason for that is that the assured water supply rules for those two AMAs don't include any incidental recharge for those AMAs. So something we are going to be talking about in our next Safe Field technical meeting for the 5th management plans is using kind of that same 4% incidental recharge rate for the Prescott and Santa Cruz AMAs, just for the purposes of calculating safe yield. Or, I mean, and then there's overlap here. We could also use that same rate for calculating something like unreplenished groundwater demands. I think there's a good argument to be made for including those same rates for the Santa Cruz and Prescott AMAs.
Thank you, Natalie. You know, I'll just add real quick that one of the thoughts that we had as we were as we worked through this issue brief is, and it's noted in the issue brief that a large challenge is going to be, well, we thought that first off, it was just important to be aware of what the amount of unreplenished groundwater withdrawal was being allowed and what was occurring. And certainly there's many reasons, all legal reasons, they're all legally supported of why this groundwater pumping is occurring. And it just seems that if we're moving forward into looking at 2025 and beyond, that it was important for us to grapple with this issue. Have no idea what the strategy or solution would look like, but it just seemed like we at least need to be honest with ourselves about the amount of groundwater pumping that is still allowed under the groundwater management code, and to look at if there's any way that we can help to minimize minimize that pumping or incentivize a way of replenishing that groundwater withdrawal. So I will assume that the lack of comments means that the brief does a pretty good job of what I just described. So, and it gives us an opportunity to start exploring the next step. So why don't we go ahead and look at the next slide. So I'm going to kind of pivot now from the issue briefs and hopefully get a little more discussion about the list of challenges and kind of what do we want to look at next and discuss. We had the benefit of having discussed those 3 issues at the last couple of meetings that we've had, which certainly helped with being able to put a brief together. And so wanted to see what the committee thought would, what we ought to tackle next, look at, are there other issues that should be added on here? And so I'll pause and open it up and see if there's any thoughts in regards with this list of challenges.
Pam is curious as to what is orphan water. I think that goes back to what Mr. Dave Dunham had mentioned in one of our earlier meetings. And Terry Sue wants to know if she can adopt orphan water.
That is a good question, and if you give me a second here, I'm trying to find, because I don't remember off the top of my head how to define it. And you're right, I don't know if Doug is on the phone and would, but here's how we defined it. It's understand implications of water that is not clearly defined in statute, such as industrial process water and mixed source drain water from irrigation districts. So it's potentially something that could be adopted. But I think this also falls into a comment that was made by Dave Roberts earlier about, well, how much water is actually, are we talking about, falls in this category, and is it worth, is it something that needs to be prioritized or not? Other thoughts?
Mr. Tamur has his hand raised. Go ahead.
Hey, Warren. So one of the things I wanted to put on the list, at least for discussion, is just sort of the framework that most of these issues, if not all of them, are issues that we've been dealing with from the past, or ongoing management strategies and conditions that we have. And when we look out into the future, one of the things that I hear a lot about, and I think is something we should consider at least addressing as a challenge, is the impact of climate change on groundwater. All the things that we think we know about it are at least subject to being renewed or addressed, or might be even fundamentally changing into the future, even absent all of these management strategies. So I don't have a finer point to put on it other than bringing up climate change as a challenge in the post-2025 world.
Thank you, Tim. And that certainly something we can add to the list and figure out what's the best way of structuring, I guess you could say, that issue and how it is an issue in regards with groundwater management.
I see Mr. Beverly has his hand raised. I'm going to unmute you, sir. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I'm looking at this line, groundwater recharge for streams and wildlife, and that really resonates with me. Living here in Chino Valley, near the headwaters of the Verde River, I just want to point out that 5 of 6 of Arizona's original perennial rivers are severely compromised and dry, and their riparian environment is totally compromised. The Verde is one of the last remaining best ones, and one of the big threats to continued base flow of the Verde is groundwater pumping in the Big Chino aquifer. Now, Big Chino is not part of any AMA. I'm assuming that this committee is open to considering better groundwater management outside of AMAs. In the 87% of Arizona that's not included, the groundwater in those areas is in rural areas that is very important to continued base flows of streams and rivers, which support riparian environments and wildlife. So I'd like to suggest that this topic be entered onto the list. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. This had come up before, of looking at the impact in AMAs regarding streams and wildlife. As you pointed out, a lot of streams and are outside of the AMAs and are in rural Arizona. There is a committee of the Governor's Water Council that is looking at groundwater issues outside of the AMAs. It's called the Non-AMA Groundwater Committee. And I think that would be a good suggestion to bring up also with them. But I think it's also something that we could look at in regards to the issue within the AMAs.
Got a comment from, or a question from Krista McJunkin that says, do we need a paper on the protection of water stored underground?
So, Krista, do you want to elaborate a little on that?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thinking about, considerable, obviously, as shown in the paper on the hydrologic disconnect, considerable amount of water has been stored underground. And are the right protections in place to ensure that that water is available when when it is needed to be recovered in the future? If you kind of put together the amount of stored water with the amount of unreplenished groundwater pumping, you could see there could be a concern about groundwater pumping harming stored water, and really just asking the question, do we have the right protections in place?
Okay. Thank you.
And Carlos notes that he kind of agrees with that comment on protection of stored water.
So one of the issues that is on the list that we had talked about, that we've talked about but haven't really dived into, is in regards with some of the issues with the CAGRD, particularly the one in regards to does there need to be any further limits for enrollment, as well as looking at whether there's sufficient supplies for future replenishment. So I was wondering if this was also something that we could further discuss either now or probably a little more easily at a future meeting.
I see, Spencer, you raised your hand, sir. If I can just unmute you. Go ahead.
Sure, just Spencer Camps with the Home Builders Association. Warren, to your final comments, I don't think now, and this is not the forum to talk about the GRD, quite honestly. Maybe I prefer not to talk about it at all, but I guess if we're going to a meeting would be better.
Spencer, I didn't hear quite the last part that you said, that you'd prefer in, was it that you said you'd prefer in a meeting, not here right now?
In a meeting?
Yes, okay, thank you. Well, and that would be my preference. I mean, I am grateful for modern technology that lets us get all together, but it's also quite challenging because I don't know, it's hard to read the silence. In a meeting in person, you can read the silence a lot better. But it's a challenge here in a room with over 75 participants all looking at it. So Any other list of challenges or anything that anyone would like to add to the list? If not, let's move on to the next slide, which is a very simple one, maybe, and that's looking at next steps. So what Tim and I, along with ADWR, would like to do is we'd like to move forward with finalizing those 3 issue briefs. And so what we would appreciate, we've heard the comments regarding them today. We will do our best to address those comments, as well as if anyone wants to provide any additional suggestions, we appreciate that by June 3rd, by a week from today, or a week from tomorrow, I should say. You know, again, a challenge with when we receive comments is please understand it's very difficult with a committee of this size to do all the wordsmithing that might be suggested. So we appreciate if you can focus your comments on if there's something of substance that needs to be included. And we, again, will take the comments also from today.
Warren, I also see that Dennis has raised his hand.
Oh, sure.
Okay. Go ahead, Dennis.
Thank you. Warren, I believe you indicated that you were planning to add some sort of a table with some data in it to the hydrologic disconnect paper. Is that correct? And I guess the primary question I have is how do we take a look at that in order to finalize it as a group?
Yeah. I know there was a suggestion about a table. I think the overall suggestion was to provide some type of context, or put a context in there in regards with unreplenished, between pumping and unreplenished. So we will take a look at how to, whether a table or if it's something, or including numbers in the narrative as they kind of already are. We'll have to wrestle with that. And then we will figure out a way to, you know, get input or to make sure that everyone is okay with how something like that is done. And so we'll just need to, Tim and I will need to talk along with ADWR on the best way to do that. We'll do our best to make sure there is no surprise and that you'll get a chance to see that.
And Carol also notes that if we need additional analysis further down the road, perhaps we can do that too.
Right.
And I just want to add that to Krista McJunkin's idea about the protection of stored underground water, that Healy Paul supports that idea, if there's any room or time for that issue to be examined.
Okay. Thank you. So what we'll do our best in, you know, once we get any additional comments on the 3rd to figure a way to, or we will do our best on finalizing then those 3 issue briefs. And then what we'd like to do is we would like to have another committee meeting most likely in July. We're wrestling with how's the best way to keep this process moving with all of the current situation that I know you're all aware of, and trying to find the best way to create dialogue and discussion if we're still having to meet remotely. So right now, we're tentatively looking at July. We do not have a date yet, but as soon as we do, we will let you know. And we will then start having some discussion about some of those issues that we just noted. And then we welcome any comments or suggestions on how we can encourage your involvement. Again, meeting in person is preferable, but we welcome any suggestions on how to maybe conduct these meetings. If we're having to conduct them remotely, what's the way to encourage more conversation? So that's right now what we have planned for the next steps. We would hope that our intention is still that once those the first 3 issue briefs are finalized, that they would be presented to the Governor's Water Council and begin developing. That then would give us an opportunity to start looking at how to come up with a strategy or solution to address those issues. So,
Warren, we have a
yes,
hand raised by Eric Brown.
Yes, Eric.
Thanks, Zach, for the Avatar reference. I see you too, buddy. I comment on the process. I think that the way that you're doing this with some general discussion of topics, then trying to consolidate everything into these issue papers and having multiple rounds of comments, as maybe kind of clunky as that can feel, I think it's a really good way to do it, because we can definitely see a work product, and then we can all have an opportunity to comment on that work product. I know it takes some extra effort from you and your staff, but I think it's a good way to go about this with the situation that we have right now. So kudos, appreciate that, all that effort that you all have put in on it, as well as you too, Tim. I know you've been actively involved as well, but I think that this is about as good of a way to do this as we're going to get right now. And to keep going, I think we should just keep going with the same methodology.
Thank you. Any other comments or suggestions?
Let's see, issue briefs. Will the issue brief be posted? Okay. So, Isaacson Law Firm. If you go to the AWR website and go to the GWAKE button underneath programs, so say Governor's Water Augmentation Innovation Conservation Council, and then you scroll down on that webpage down to the post-2025 AMAs, and I'll even include that link one more time for everybody. And underneath that, there'll be a tab for documents, and you'll click on that tab, and all the issue briefs will be listed there. There's the link for you.
Thank you, Zach. And so, yes, please take a look at it. Make sure you're looking at the second draft, the second version of the issue briefs. Tim, is there anything that you'd like to add before we wrap up? I mean, it's always good to wrap up a meeting early, so wanted to see if you had any comments.
Just wanted to say thanks for leading us through this. I know you had a long 90 minutes of herding the cat, so thanks for taking the lead on this one, Warren.
Thank you, Tim. Well, I want to say again, it is much appreciated that we have this large of a turnout for this committee. And we really appreciate, again, the comments, the feedback that we received, not just today, but also on that first draft of the issue briefs. Those were very helpful, and appreciate those of you who took the time and effort to provide us those comments. We are open to hearing from you, and feel free to contact me or Tim or ADWR, whether it be Carol or Zach, and feel free to ask questions or provide suggestions and ideas for this committee. As Eric Brown said, this is kind of clunky, but we will do our best to continue to make sure that this clunky process is productive, and a lot of that is based on your efforts and all of the input that you guys provide. So with that, thank you again, and we will keep you posted, and appreciate and hope that you have a good rest of your week. Thank you.